Old Testament? How often do you read the Old Testament? Especially the stories of the Old Testament. I don't mean just the big ones, the top 10, the top 40. David and Goliath, Adam and Eve, Daniel and the lion's den. These are really well known, and for good reason. But if you content yourself just there, then it's sort of like living in Maine and only ever visiting Baxter State Park in Mount Katahdin. Katahdin's great, but there's more. There's an awful lot more. Now, of course, a lot of people have a hard time with the Old Testament. First of all, there are all those hard names to pronounce, like Mephibosheth and Methuselah. And so sometimes, the names, they come in these lists that are really long, and so sometimes as we're reading it, we wonder if we're reading the Bible or a tongue twister. The Old Testament has hard names. It also has lots of violence. There's a lot of wars recorded in the Old Testament. Some of these wars have been commanded by God, and frankly, we don't always know what to do with that. It makes us wonder if the Old Testament God is the same as the New Testament God, because here comes Jesus in the New Testament. He says, not only love your neighbors, but also love your enemies. The Old Testament is sometimes hard to pronounce. Sometimes it feels overly violent. And the Old Testament is, well, just that. It's old. That is, since Jesus comes, a lot of us think, and have been taught to think, that he makes what we call a new covenant, and that means that, well, the old covenant must be entirely obsolete, must be entirely going away. By the way, the idea of a new covenant does not come from the New Testament, it comes from the Old Testament, but I'll leave that alone for now. But we say this, right? Out with the old, in with the new. In fact, the book of Hebrews seems to suggest this, or even say it straight out. In the book of Hebrews chapter 8, verse 13, it says, when he said a new covenant, he has made the first obsolete. But whatever is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to disappear. Well, for some of us, a verse like this is a relief, right? Oh, good, we don't have to deal with the Old Testament. If the Old Testament is obsolete, we don't have to figure out all that weird stuff that's going on back there. Then again, Jesus says some things that make us sort of back up a little bit if we're inclined to do that. First, he says in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, he says, do not think that I came to abolish the law and the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I say to you, unless heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke shall pass from the law until all is accomplished. Jesus says that he has not come to make the Old Testament go away. He says that the Old Testament will last as long as how long? The heavens and the earth. He says that even stroke, every letter, every dot of the I will last at least that long. And then there's also what Jesus says after the resurrection. A lot of us will be familiar with this story in Luke 24. We find two men walking. They're walking with a stranger on the road to Emmaus, and they're talking about Jesus who has been crucified. And the stranger says, who's that you're talking about? And they say, are you the only one in the world who has not known about Jesus? And the cool thing is that, of course, it was Jesus. And so he reveals himself to them. And in Luke 24:27, he says this, at the beginning with Moses and all of the prophets, he explained to them the things concerning himself in all the scriptures. So Jesus does not explain Moses and all the prophets here. He's not saying, here's how every possible meaning of Moses and the prophets. What he says is he's explaining himself through the law and the prophets. He does not say, in order to understand me, you're going to have to get rid of the Old Testament. He says instead, in order for you to understand me, you're going to have to read the Old Testament. And here's how. That's what Jesus says on the road to Emmaus. So if you get rid of the Old Testament, you will have no idea what's going on in the Gospels. If you ignore the Old Testament, you will find yourself pretty often pretty lost in the New. Theologian Herman Bavinck says it this way, the promise culminates in the fulfillment. The Old Testament culminates in that of the New. The one is incomplete without the other. The relationship is like that of a pedestal and a statue, a lock and a key, a shadow and a body. You can imagine that, right? Say you're looking around in your old barn and you find a lock, but you don't know where the key is. Or sometimes it's the other way when you're in an old barn, that you find a key, but where in the world is the lock? Well, that's what it's like to have half a Bible. Many Christians today have a seriously hard time with, the Bible in general. Too often, we just don't understand what's going on. Part of the problem, of course, is our modern impatience. We don't even like a video that lasts for an hour anymore, let alone a book that takes many hours. But more than that, what happens is that our trouble with the Bible is that we have often started in the middle of the story instead of the beginning. Often what we're doing is we're looking for little encouraging verses to help our day. And then when we find the verse, we do a little Google search, or we see something on our mug, or we find a little Bible promise book, and we say, okay, there's the verse for today, and I'm going to think about that, and that's going to encourage me for today. And then we actually read the verse, and we think we're going to be encouraged, and as it turns out, we're not. You've experienced this? You found the Bible verse that's supposed to be encouraging, and it wasn't. It didn't do it. That is, we're not really changed by it. And what I want to suggest to you is that very often what that is that we have no idea where that verse goes in the overall story of things. That is, think of about one verse as one screw in an entire airplane engine. To be sure, that screw is important. But where does it go, and how does it fit with everything else? Well, today we're in Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 through 11, and Paul's going to tell us that God gave us Old Testament stories to help us. God gave us Old Testament stories to help us, not just to help the people who lived there and then, a long time ago, but rather even just to help us. One book title says it this way: He gave us stories. And that's the title for the sermon. He, God, gave us stories. And that's the big idea for the morning. He gave us Old Testament stories. So read them. Read them like they're for you, because they are for you. Well, again, we might say, well, how can this be? Because after all, in the New Testament, things change, right? And we are New Testament Christians, aren't we? And so much has changed. And so how can these stories really be for us? And so I'm going to try to answer that today. The answer is threefold. It's true that some things are different, but believers in both Testaments, according to this text, share important territory, and we're going to name three of them. We share, number one, the same spiritual family. And number two, the same spiritual blessings. And number three, the same spiritual consequences. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, come with me if you would. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, 1 through 11. For I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. For they were drinking from a spiritual rock which followed them, and the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them God was not well pleased, for they were laid low in the wilderness. Now these things happened as examples for us, so that we would not crave evil things as they also craved. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and stood up to play. Nor let us act immorally, as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in one day. Nor let us try the Lord, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the serpents. Nor grumble, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now these things happened to them as an example, and they were written for our instruction, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. How can we read the Old Testament stories as though they were for us? Well, first of all, we share the same spiritual family. Back up to verse 1. He says, For I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea. Note the family terms. First, he calls them brothers. He's talking to the church. The church is filled with both Jews and Gentiles, and yet he calls them brothers. And the question is why? And the answer has to be because of what Jesus says. In Matthew chapter 12, Jesus says this, Whoever does the will of my Father who is in heaven, he is my brother and sister and mother. This is basic Christian theology, right? We learn this in Sunday school. We read this very many times in the Bible. If God is my Father and God is your Father, what does that make us? Siblings. We're spiritual brothers and sisters, even if we're not biological brothers and sisters. By the way, this is a real encouragement to many of us who've had to walk away from biological family for whatever the reason. That is, we find ourselves in profound lack of, we're not walking step by step with our biological families, and the reason for it is our faith. For some of us, that's a very intense experience. We have had to feel like we've had to actually move away from mother and father as primary in our lives because we're trying to follow Christ. That's a powerful experience, and it's a hard one. And so it's an encouragement to us because in one sense we've had to walk away from our families because of Jesus. And at the same time, what Jesus says, and of course what Paul says, is that at the same time, you have more brothers and sisters than you've ever had. We're brothers. We're sisters. Well, notice that Paul calls not just people brothers, but also fathers in the first verse. Who does he mean? He says, your fathers. He means the Jewish believers who lived in the time of Moses. He means those who were under the cloud and those who passed through the sea. The cloud that they were under is the cloud that led them through the wilderness. It was the cloud that protected them from Pharaoh's army. Do you remember that? Pharaoh's army is coming. And the cloud positions itself between the army and God's people. Oh, no, you don't, Pharaoh. It was also the cloud that filled the finished tabernacle at the end of Exodus 40, when the tabernacle is completed and the same cloud, the glory cloud, comes and fills the tabernacle so that they can't even enter it because the glory is so great. This is the cloud of the glory of God. The sea that they passed through is the Red Sea. It's the Exodus. Again, Pharaoh's army is coming, and they're coming not to play patty cake. Right? They're coming to kill with swords and to take vengeance upon them. Moses raises his hand over the water. God splits the water in two. They walk out on dry land. And Moses says, these are your spiritual dads. These are your ancestors. So, the issue here then is, have you seen the glory of God? Have you ever seen the glory of God? We just sang, open the eyes of my heart. We want to see the glory of God. Have you seen the glory of God in one way or another? They saw the same glory first. Have you been rescued by God's mighty hand? Have you been brought out of a place of slavery and into a place of freedom? They were rescued by the same mighty hand first. It does not matter if you are a Jew or a Gentile. It does not matter if you are English or if you are African. If you are a Christian, Old Testament people are kin. So why then should we read these stories as though they're for us? Well, pretty simple, right? These are family. We share the same spiritual family. That's the first point. We share the same spiritual family. The second point is that we also share the same spiritual blessings. This is an amazing passage, and it's surprising to many people when they come to 1 Corinthians 10. We're not used to speaking like this, so follow me carefully and closely. The second reason we need to read the Old Testament stories as though they're for us is that we share the same spiritual blessings. Verse 2. And all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. For they were drinking from a spiritual rock which followed them, and the rock was Christ. So we tend to think about baptism as being just a New Testament thing, right? Here, it's described as an Old Testament kind of thing. Paul says that the Red Sea was a kind of baptism. And by the way, that's not the only time that the New Testament speaks about an Old Testament event as though it's a kind of baptism. In 1 Peter chapter 3, we're told that Noah's Ark is a kind of baptism too. In 1 Peter chapter 3, we read this: the patience of God kept waiting in the days of Noah during the construction of the ark, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safe through the water. Corresponding to that, baptism now saves you, not the removal of dirt from the flesh, but an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The point here is that there's an analogy. In the flood and in baptism, God uses water to make a separation between the saved and the unsaved. Noah and Noah's family are saved in the ark. Just picture them there, right? The boat floating on the water. For them, the water is the water of rescue. For everyone else, the water is the water of judgment. There's a separation. Something very similar is going on in the Exodus. Think about it. For Israel, the water was also the water of rescue. That is, they go out through the Red Sea, and then when they're all done, what happens? But the sea collapses back on them. So Egypt, then they face the same waters, but they're the waters of judgment. And so after Israel has passed through, God let the waters crash back down, and as we say in Exodus 15, the Song of Moses, the horse and the rider were hurled into the sea. Something very similar happens in baptism. It's not alike in every way, but there's something that it's important for you to understand that it is like it. That is, we go into the water, and God brings out something new and different. He has made a separation. He has claimed us as his own. And we need to take this seriously because one way or the other, the water is coming. And the question is, for us today, you here now need to ask this question: do you want to be in the ark or left outside? Do you want to be with Israel or with Egypt? Do you want to be in the water of God's rescue or in the waters of his wrath? Not that baptism saves you all by itself, but that in baptism, what God is doing is something real to you. He's honestly making a separation. And so it's the same thing that he's been doing from the beginning. It's not a totally new idea in the New Testament that there be baptism. God's been separating out his people through water forever. Same spiritual blessing. Now, how can I speak this way? And I have to say, well, it's because Paul speaks this way, because Peter speaks this way, because the whole Bible speaks this way. You know, we tend to, and I was taught this as a kid, to look at the story of Noah and the ark and only think about physical rescue. Or to read the story of the Exodus and only think about, oh, look, God's saving a nation for himself. It's just about politics. It's just about nationhood. And what Paul is saying here is, do not think that. It's so crude to think that the Old Testament is just physical stuff going on, but we have spiritual stuff. That's spiritual stuff too. And therefore, when you get baptized or when you see a baptism, you should not think, I feel sorry for the people of the Old Testament because they never got to experience anything like this. In fact, what you should say is something very different. You should say, here I am connected by baptism to Noah and to Moses and all the people in the Red Sea. Only with this difference. They were all baptized into Moses, it says, God's human representative. Who are we baptized into but Jesus Christ? The baptism is the shadow. Ours is the reality. Well, if Old Testament people got to experience a kind of baptism, guess what else they got to experience? A kind of communion. Paul describes here as they were eating spiritual food and spiritual drink. The spiritual food was manna, the bread from heaven that God supplied to them in the wilderness. Every day they would gather it up, and it was sweet to the taste. And they got to keep going through the wilderness another day. The spiritual drink was the water that God supplied for them when Moses hit the rock with his staff. Do you remember that story? The story comes to us from Exodus 17. The people are thirsty and they are afraid, and frankly, they're ticked. They're angry at God and they're angry at Moses. And so in Exodus 17, we read this. And then the Lord said to Moses, pass before the people and take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand your staff, which you struck the Nile, and go. And behold, I will stand before you there on the rock of Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water shall come out of it, and the people may drink. And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel, and he named the place Massah and Meribah, because of the quarrel of the sons of Israel, and because they tested the Lord, saying, is the Lord among us or not? Well, here in 1 Corinthians 10, Paul looks back on this story, and he says, they were not just drinking physical water, they were drinking spiritual water. They were actually drinking from Christ himself. And we look back on that text and we think, I didn't see that. Where did he get that? Did he just want to see Jesus everywhere? He's one of these people who just sees Jesus everywhere, and he just kind of said, I'm going to import it there? I would submit to you, no. He sees Christ in that rock because what he's doing is he's reading that story carefully and in context with the rest of the other stories he's been given. In Deuteronomy 32, what we have is we call it the Song of Moses. And Moses teaches the people to sing to God as a rock. The rock. His work is perfect. for all his ways are just. A God of faithfulness and without injustice. Righteousness and upright is he. For Moses, not just Paul, but for Moses, this rock that he sees, it's not just a rock, it's God himself. In fact, it says in the story that God himself would be upon the rock. The rock is God. Moses sees that the rock is God. And Paul looks back and he says, oh, 2 + 2 is 4. That is, if this rock is God and the rock was struck in order to bring forth water, who is the God who was struck? And Paul says that's Jesus Christ. And what was the result when Jesus Christ was struck and hit? But that living water came out and flowed, and by the Holy Spirit, the people now drink. What I'm saying, again, I need to say this again and again, because I think we tend to think about the Old Testament as being crudely physical. We tend to think that everything back there is just stuff, just water, just a trip around the Red Sea, just bread. And the water from the rock was just water, and therefore the rock was just a rock. And Paul says, actually, guys, the rock was Christ. When God gave the people water in the wilderness, he was giving them himself. And isn't that what we celebrate all the time? Who does God give us in order to keep us going? Who does God give us in order to make the separation? He gives us himself. This is what God has been doing from the beginning. And so here is Jesus in the Old Testament, like for real, not smuggled in, carefully drawn out, because Jesus Christ, Son of God, eternal Son of God, doesn't start in the New Testament, right? He's there. So if you ask, how can the Old Testament stories really be connected to us? I'm going to say, well, we have the same spiritual family, and we're also sharing the same spiritual blessings, both baptism and communion, at least. Now we come to Paul's main point in this passage. Because if we share the same spiritual family and we share the same spiritual blessings as the people of the Old Testament, then we also share in the same spiritual, and this is where it's going to get hard, we share the same spiritual consequences. Come again to 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 5. Nevertheless, with most of them God was not well pleased, for they were laid low in the wilderness. Now these things happened as examples for us, so that we would not crave evil things as they also craved. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and stood up to play. Nor let us act immorally, as some of them did. And 23,000 fell in one day. Nor let us try the Lord, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the serpents. Nor grumble, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now these things happened to them as an example, and they were written for our instruction, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. Paul starts listing here a bunch of Old Testament stories. He's piling them all up. First, he alludes to the idolatry in the famous story of the golden calf in Exodus 32. Then he alludes to the story of Phinehas. Remember the story of Phinehas? And the people are committing great sexual immorality from Numbers 25. And then he next alludes to the story of Moses and the bronze serpent. You'll be familiar with this story, even if you're reading the New Testament, because Jesus quotes it also in John 3. That's from Numbers 21. He piles up all these stories. The last one, the bronze serpent, is a story about how God's people grumble against God, grumble against God, grumble against God until God's had enough. Why does Paul mention these particular stories? It's because he, in the New Testament church, is looking around at the church in Corinth, and he sees the same things going on. We have seen the same things. We've been marching through the book of 1 Corinthians. Now we're in chapter 10. Think back what we've seen in the other 9 chapters. In Exodus 32, the Old Testament people are worshiping idols. In 1 Corinthians chapter 8, what we see is the church are also trying to worship idols by eating meat that have been offered there. In Numbers 25, the Old Testament church is committing sexual sin. Well, what's going on in chapter 5 of 1 Corinthians? But that we see a man committing incest and bragging about it. In Numbers 21, the Old Testament church grumbles against God, and grumbles against Moses. And what have we been seeing in the 1 Corinthian church again and again and again? But these people are quarreling all the time with one another. They're quarreling and fighting and grumbling against God. So the point that Paul is making is they are us. And that's Paul's point. The Old Testament stories are not just for us, they are us. They're describing us. And I could keep on going. You can make application again and again. In the Old Testament, people are saved in the Exodus. God separates for himself a people. And yet many of them wanted to go back to Egypt. And yet there are people here who have believed and have been baptized and still just sort of do their own thing. In the Old Testament, the church ate spiritual food and drank spiritual drink and then gave themselves over to immorality. And each week, some of us take communion even though we have given ourselves to pornography in our minds and our viewing practices on the internet. In the Old Testament, the people enjoyed the good gifts of God again and again and again. And again and again, they grumble. They're grumpy. They're unhappy. They're unthankful. And, we say, praise God from whom all blessings flow, and then we look around and we say, why are they in this church? So it's a scary thing because sin brings judgment. And too often, again, what we see is the Old Testament judgments of God. We see the Old Testament people of God sinning, and then we see the consequences, and we kind of think, foolish Israelites. Why didn't they just obey? Why didn't they just believe? And Paul's point here is this. People of God, honestly, New Testament Christians today in the 21st century in Pittsfield, Maine, be careful. We're not above it. Right? We're not above it. In the book of Hebrews, chapter 6, the New Testament says this, for in the case of those who have once been enlightened and have tasted of the heavenly gift and have been made partakers of the Holy Spirit and have tasted the good word of God and the powers of the age to come and then have fallen away, it is impossible to renew them again to repentance, since they again crucified to themselves the Son of God and put him to open shame. For ground that drinks the rain, which often falls on it and brings forth vegetation, useful to those whose sake it is also tilled, they receive a blessing from God. But if it yields thorns and thistles, it's worthless and close to being cursed, and it ends up being burned. But the passage and all of these stories set before us a really clear question, and this is the question of the day. And let me just beg you to think about it when the service is over, when lunchtime is over, to think about it. The question is this: what table am I going to eat from, and what am I going to do with it once I've eaten? What table am I going to eat from, and what am I going to do with it once I have in fact eaten? The people of God, the Lord has set before his people life and death. Choose life. Eat from the table of God. And that means communion, but that also means his word. That also means his people. That also means prayer. That also means everything that it has to do with the Lord. You eat from that table. Eat from that table, even as the Israelites did. But unlike the Israelites, and frankly, unlike so many of the people in the Corinthian church, when you eat from that table, let that turn to you not just something that you grab and don't remember, but rather that you take and you live differently accordingly. Let it fuel new life. And if you have a hard time with all of this, let me encourage you to read the Old Testament stories. Read them deeply. Read them often. That's why he gave them to us. And when you come on to the hard parts, and there are hard parts, the parts that are hard to pronounce, or the parts that are violent, or the parts that feel a little bit questionable as far as, does this part still count, or are they out of date? Remind yourself, before you even open up the cover, remind yourself this: this is my spiritual family. I share the same spiritual blessings, and if I'm not careful, I will experience the same spiritual consequences. I invite you to stand up and to